anonymously icon in the Q&A text box. Once questions start coming through, Kramer and I will read them out to Peter to answer. And now I'll hand it over to Kramer to introduce Peter.
Yeah, so thanks, Sitara. And also, thank you very much, Peter, for coming to, well, not coming, but, attending online to speak with us. Okay, I guess I'll also note one thing as well. So this is being recorded, but we're not going to, if you want to ask questions, we're not going to read your names out. So don't feel shy about that. And I don't think anything that's typed will count in the recording. Okay, so before sort of Peter does a presentation, I'll just give a brief introduction. So probably most of us are very familiar with Peter and his work. But here's sort of a brief overview. So this is the first talk that we're doing as part of the Young Animal Justice Party New South Wales Speciesism awareness and I suppose education campaign. Okay, Peter Singer is a philosopher. He's the R.W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton. He's been massively influential in the animal protection movement, as well as the effective altruism movement. He's also been influential in philosophy with his defense of, defense and I guess support of utilitarianism, especially in normative ethics and bioethics. He's the co-founder of Animals Australia and the founder of Life You Can Save. And he's the author of many different books on ethics, including Animal Liberation, Practical Ethics, and The Life You Can Save, which you can download for free from thelifeyoucansave.org. And I'll just note as well, he's also very personally influential in my own decision to become vegan and get involved in the animal protection movement. So very grateful for that. So without further ado, thank you, Peter. I'll let you talk before we get into Q&A.
Great, thanks very much. And it's good to be with you all here virtually. As I suppose many of you know, I had plans to be in Sydney in the first weekend of April, speaking at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, and also then accepted an invitation to speak to the Young Animal Justice group. But we all know what happened with that. So this is the next best thing. Kramer, you mentioned speciesism and a campaign about speciesism awareness. So I think let me start with that concept, which is fundamental to my thinking about animals, but sometimes is not completely well understood, including by people who are sympathetic to the idea. So firstly, let me acknowledge that I didn't invent the term speciesism. I saw it on the heading of a little one-page flyer that a man called Richard Ryder was distributing in Oxford in 1970 or 71, when I was a graduate student in Oxford, and just met a couple of people who were vegetarian, not vegan, because nobody even knew what that word meant then, but certainly we're thinking about animals and the ethics of how we ought to treat animals. And that heading intrigued me. I got to know Richard Ryder quite well later, and it seemed to me to be interesting in that it made a parallel clearly between things that we, or when I say we, most people that I meet reject, racism and sexism most obviously, and something that most people unquestioningly accept and act on, and that is speciesism. So as a graduate student in philosophy and ethics, I looked at some of the literature about why we oppose racism, why we think that there's some sense in which all humans are equal. And it seemed to me when I looked at that, that the fundamental basis for equality was that all humans, at least those who are not in permanent irreversible comas or something like that, have interests. Their lives can go well or badly. Most basically, they can enjoy their lives, they can experience pleasure, or they can suffer and they can feel pain. And the pain of any human being is just as important as the pain of any other human being, irrespective of their race to see, why we're opposed to racism, because racists give less attention or less weight to the sufferings of people who are not of their race or not of some preferred race. And the same is true for sexism. So irrespective of race or gender. But if that is the basis, the most solid basis for opposition to racism and sexism, then how does it exclude animals? After all, animals also have interests. They can also suffer or feel pain. When I say animals here, I suppose I'm mostly thinking of vertebrates and some invertebrates. I'm not necessarily saying this applies to oysters. So, there are attempts always to reduce an animal liberation or anti-species position to absurdity. And it's quite possible that oysters can't feel anything, so they can't experience pleasure or pain. But for all animals who can experience pleasure or pain, that ought to count. And we should not say, yes, but it's only an animal, as if that was a reason for dismissing it or ignoring it. It may be a reason, though, for thinking that it's different, that different species have different capacities and different senses, and just as individual humans also are different in various ways. So that may be relevant. But the major point that I wanted to make by using the term speciesism is that we are discriminating against animals by refusing to take their interests as seriously as we would take similar interests of human beings. So we're not as concerned about the pain or suffering of animals as we are about similar amounts and similar kinds of pain and suffering of humans. And I think we see that all the time. And a couple of in fact, the two longest chapters in my book, Animal Liberation, describe that in two major areas of where we cause pain and suffering to animals, in raising them for food, especially factory farming, and in research on animals in laboratory experiments. And it's pretty clear there that we do not give anything like the same weight to the lives of animals, to the sufferings and enjoyment of lives of animals that we give to humans. So that was the major point that I really wanted to make by drawing attention to that idea and arguing that there is a sense, just as we say that all humans are equal, so there's a sense in which all animals or all sentient beings are equal. And that sense is that if they can feel pain, their pain matters equally much. It doesn't matter what race they are, or what sex or gender they are, or what species they are, if they're in pain. Now, as I say, that's the basic idea, and I think it's reasonably straightforward. But people may misunderstand it. Sometimes people willfully misunderstand it because they want to parody it, because they're opposed to the idea. And that's the kind of argument that says, well, does that mean I can't slap a mosquito or something of that sort? But also sometimes I think people on the pro-animal side perhaps become too absolute because they understand the idea of not discriminating against animals as if it meant treating them equally. And it doesn't, because clearly different species have different sorts of interests, and equal treatment, or the kind of treatment we give to beings, must depend on what matters to them, what will benefit them, what will harm them, and in what ways it will benefit or harm them. So clearly there are things that you can do to humans that wouldn't really matter to animals, like you could deny humans an education, which would be very bad for them, but wouldn't be bad for animals. And in various other ways, our interests differ. And perhaps the most important one that I'll just briefly mention is it doesn't follow from the rejection of speciesism that it's equally wrong to kill any animal as that it is as serious as it is to kill any human being. What does follow, I think, is that humans and animals with similar kinds of capacities, that it's equally bad to kill one or the other, just considering them in themselves. But if we consider human beings who have plans for the future because they can their lives as extending over many years or decades, and they're doing things directed to that future. They're studying now because they want to follow a certain career or profession many years later. And we compare that with the life of a non-human animal. There is going to be a difference. Animals don't plan ahead to that extent. They may plan ahead to some degree, depending on the species. I think there's some evidence about planning in chimpanzees and other great apes, but they certainly don't plan for what they're going to be doing in several years' time and undertake activities now that are consciously directed towards things that they're doing in several years' time. So on that basis, we might argue that to kill a human with those sorts of hopes and plans for the future against that person's wishes is to do a kind of a wrong that has no exact parallel with non-human animals, because it's to thwart all of those plans. It's to make pointless the activities that that human was engaged in, directed towards achieving those goals later on. And if animals don't have those plans and don't direct their activities towards those goals, then there is no exact parallel. So that's why I think, while it's very important to say that we should not give less weight to the sufferings or pleasures of animals compared with similar sufferings or pleasures of humans, it doesn't follow that we need to give equal weight to taking the life of an animal in a painless way as we would give to taking the life of a normal human being. So that's probably enough from me now about the philosophical basis of what I'm arguing. I expect we'll get lots of questions that will give me opportunities to elaborate on that. But the other thing I want to say, since I'm speaking to people who are supporting a political party, is that I think politics is the art of the practical. It's the art of trying to achieve change in society, and inevitably, in trying to achieve things in a political arena, compromises are necessary. So while you might say, well, people who join an animal justice party aren't really, they're certainly not focused on achieving taking office in the way that members of the major political power might be, and perhaps they're there as a wake-up call to the conscience of the electorate. But I think political parties ought to be more than that. And I think if you have elected members of parliament, as I know you have in New South Wales, then there is perhaps the possibility of actually getting something practical done for animals as well. And I don't think that those ought to be foregone simply because what you're getting is not what the Animal Justice Party would want if it were to be in a position where it could enact the legislation that it wants. So I think this is, I mention this because it's been an issue, I think, with minority parties. It's been an issue with the Greens, which I've, been a candidate for the Australian Greens. And I just wanted to say where I stand on these issues. I think even if we can't get what we want, we do want to do what we can for animals here and now, while making it clear, of course, that those goals that we might be able to achieve, let's say in Australia in the next few years, are not going to come anywhere near satisfying the changes that we want for animals. All right, that's probably enough from me. So let's get into Q&A and discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you out there.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Peter. Really appreciate it. That was wonderful. We have probably about an hour and a bit over that for the actual Q&A, so we're hoping to wrap up by around 9 o'clock. So yeah, send through your questions and Kramer and I will start filtering through them and ask them.
Okay, cool. Sitara, should you go first or should I go first?
So I've actually got a couple of questions that were sent prior to the event, so I'm happy to start off with these. Is that all right?
Are you asking me? Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
Oh, you're asking me. Sorry. Well, you
Okay.
you run the meeting the way you want to run it, Sitara and Kramer. That's up to you. But
Yeah, sure. So Peter, what are the ethical questions and factors we need to consider in managing to transition away from a predominantly meat-based diet and meat industry?
what are the ethical factors? The question was asking, was it?
Yeah, to transition away.
Yeah. Well, consistently with what I was saying towards the end of those remarks, we know what the goals are here, right? We would like to get society completely away from the commercial exploitation of animals in producing food, as well as in many other areas of life. So that's the ultimate goal. But I think the ethical factors are that if you have an opportunity to benefit animals, to reduce their suffering in some non-trivial way, and that is not going to harm the struggle for greater and more significant reforms later on, then I think you should go ahead with that. You should say that you'll support those initiatives. Now, of course, the objection might be made, well, isn't this going to harm the struggle later on? I know that this has been said by some groups, particularly in the United States. I'm familiar with the debate there. When, for example, there have been referenda in some states where where states have the mechanism for citizens-initiated referenda. California is perhaps the most notable example. And animal groups have put up suggestions for eliminating the worst forms of confinement in factory farms. So eliminating the small wire cages that don't allow hens to stretch their wings even, eliminating the sow stalls that keep breeding sows from even turning around, just narrow stalls on bare concrete or metal slats that they can't really move more than a step forward or backwards in. So when those things were put up at these referenda, some people were saying, well, this will make meat more acceptable, more tolerable, and so we shouldn't support this referenda because we really want to get rid of meat altogether. We want to get rid of the property status of animals. We want to get rid of all of this kind of exploitation. Well, it would be fantastic to end all exploitation of animals, of course, but I don't see any sign of this happening in the near future. I hope it will happen in the longer term future, but I don't see it happening in the next decade or so, let's say. And if we have the opportunity to enable hens to be able to walk around and stretch their wings freely, to enable sows to move around, to be housed in groups rather than in individual stalls, and that will affect hundreds of millions of animals over the next decade or two. I think it would actually be unethical to say, no, I'm not going to support that because I really want something more. Because in saying that, you're essentially leaving all of those animals to their current conditions when you could improve it. And there is no ironclad proof that this will harm the movement for getting rid of meat at all. In fact, there's some reason to think that it may help it because after all, the reason that factory farmers have these forms of confinement is because they're cheaper. They enable them to produce their product at a lower price and they can compete in the marketplace better if they use them. So anything that prevents that will slightly anyway increase the price of those animal products. And that means that when we're trying to get plant-based products onto the market, or perhaps in the not so distant future, cultured meat products, which are grown at a cellular level and have nothing to do with any sentient being, onto the market, they'll have a better chance of competing because price is important in what consumers are going to choose. So, far from assuming that these kinds of reforms will make meat stick around longer, I think that's completely uncertain, and it's at least arguable that it will help to get rid of meat.
Great. Can you take the next one, Kramer?
Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of questions here relating to, I guess, the impact on our treatment of animals due to the whole COVID-19 thing. So I guess there are sort of two parts to this. One is, do you think that the relationship between, I guess the animal origins of COVID-19 and sort of the pandemic, do you think that might have an impact on, the treatment of animals generally? And do you think this might give political parties who are sort of focused on animals, such as the Animal Justice Party, maybe a greater political platform in the next elections there?
Okay, so it's a very good question. A lot of people are talking about this at the moment. So let's start by saying, what do we know about the origins, not only of COVID-19, but of SARS and of the previous pandemic recognized by the World Health Organization, which was swine flu in 2009, and some of the avian influenza or bird flu epidemics that there have been. And they don't have the same origins. It seems reasonably clear that COVID-19 came to humans out of the so-called wet market in Wuhan. A wet market, for those not familiar with the term, is a market where live animals are caged and sold to consumers who pick them, say, I'll have one of those, and then the person running the stall slaughters it on the spot and hands the corpse over to the customer. Now, particularly in Asia and some other regions, these wet markets not only sell domesticated, chickens and other birds like that, and other animals, but they also sell wild animals. In this case, in Wuhan, they were selling pangolins, which is a kind of scaly anteater that is regarded as a delicacy by some Chinese. And that's believed to be the route by which the virus was transmitted to humans, perhaps getting into pangolins via bats. But anyway, it's pretty clear that these wet markets involving wildlife are a really high risk, because it's quite possible that SARS came through a similar route as well. It's not quite as clear as in the case of COVID-19, but that's certainly believed. So the one thing that most of the health experts looking at this are saying, quite independently of the animal movement, are saying is, we ought to prohibit the sale of wildlife at wet markets worldwide. And it looked for a while as if the World Health Organization was going to go along with that. Then they seemed to back away from that, maybe under pressure from China. But that seems to me to be a goal that you can get excellent international health authority supporting it. The Chief of Infectious Diseases in the United States, Anthony Fauci, said that seemed to him to be something pretty obviously that they ought to be banned. So, certainly Animal Justice Party could campaign for the Australian government to support that, but they're in fact already doing it. Scott Morrison and Greg Hunt have both criticised the apparent backdown of the World Health Organization. I think Morrison called it unfathomable, which is pretty strong. So that's good. And of course, we don't have these wildlife markets in Australia, at least as far as I know. If we do, they're being kept very secret. So it's not really a domestic issue. Some of the animal organizations are pushing for a ban on wet markets altogether. That is, a ban on any markets that are selling live animals and slaughtering them on the spot. And that also would be a good thing if it could happen, because obviously these wet markets are hell for animals. They're all caged up and crowded in different species. They're terrified. They're slaughtered then on the spot without anesthetic or anything like that. And yes, they are unhygienic. The animal feces and the blood and all of that is around there, attracting flies and so on. They're not pretty places. But is there a case in terms of pandemic prevention for banning wet markets that don't sell wild animals? It's not easy to see what that case is, because I don't know that we've actually traced any pandemics or epidemics to the sale of domestic animals at wet markets. So that seems to me to be something of a halfway house that you might like, but the evidence is not very good. Now, but the other big issue here is factory farming, because there is good evidence that some of the other epidemics and pandemics I mentioned have come out of factory farms. Swine flu in particular is believed to have come out of a factory farm in North Carolina. And that's killed a very large number of people. It's killed many more people than COVID-19 has so far. Maybe in a few months or something, COVID-19 will get up to similar levels. But the World Health Organization says it's something between 150,000 and 575,000 deaths. And then there are these other bird flus, a couple of which have been pretty clearly traced to poultry farms in, I think one in China and one in Thailand or somewhere, I'm not sure. Now, one of those was very deadly, actually. The virus killed a lot more people than COVID-19 kills, but it was less contagious, so it was more easily contained. But it's clearly a risk. You have these tens of thousands of animals crowded together in this shed. They're stressed and their immune systems are presumably weakened because of that. And viruses can mutate through that because they're in contact with so many animals, and then they get into the humans who are working on the factory farms, and they get out. So I think everybody who's looked at this situation agrees that factory farms do pose a risk of creating pandemics, as I said, they already did with swine flu. And it's quite possible that they'll create a pandemic which is as deadly as that example of bird flu was, but as contagious as COVID-19 is, something like that. There's no guarantee that that combination can't exist. So I think there's actually quite a strong case for saying that the pandemics are an argument against factory farming. But the trouble is that whereas the economic forces behind wet markets, especially selling wildlife, in Australia at least, are non-existent and are pretty small elsewhere, the economic forces behind factory farming are huge. But I certainly think Animal Justice Party ought to make this point, that if we want to reduce the chances of another disastrous pandemic of the sort, or worse than we've got with COVID-19, we ought to be getting rid of factory farming. We ought to have, if we're raising animals for food, they ought to be outdoors where there's more space, the viruses don't spread so much, they're healthier and stronger, all of that stuff. And I think you can make that point. I think it's a good point to make. It might get some people to stop eating meat, and that's good. It's going to be very difficult to get any major political party to support that, because of course they're going to be concerned about the backlash from people who say, hey, wait a minute, meat's going to become more expensive and we don't want to vote for that. So that's why it's part of an educational process, I think, rather than an immediate practical goal, but it should be something that you take up pretty strongly as part of an educational process.
Thank you.
Great. So I'll do the next one. So I'm kind of combining a couple of questions here. On speaking to lots of people over the years, it appears in general they do not condone the pain and suffering raising livestock. However, they cannot bring themselves to give up meat. So why do you think people make a conscious decision to look away from animal cruelty? How do otherwise lovely humans we know and love don't connect with the suffering? What can we do to convince them of its importance?
Yeah. It's a good question, and there is some interesting research just started in the last few years about this. There are people looking, people basically in psychology and behavioral economics who are looking at consumer choices people make and why they make those choices, and some of them are looking at choices that people make that are in a way contrary to their moral values. So I think we're starting to learn more about this, but we probably will learn more over the next few years. Speaking sort of unscientifically, because I haven't really done research into this myself, I suspect that social conformity is a really major factor here, that people may be prepared to acknowledge that there's something ethically wrong with what they're doing, but the problem is that everybody else is doing it. Not everybody else, unfortunately, there are more and more prominent vegetarians and vegans around now than there were 10 years ago. So that's helping. But it's still a minority, quite a small minority, relatively speaking. So I think it's hard for people to break with their friends and their families. if they're all eating meat and they think, oh, what will happen when I go home for dinner with my parents and my siblings and something, and everybody else is eating meat, and I have to say no, I'm not going to eat that, even though they know I've been eating it for all of my life up to now. That's a kind of a difficult and somewhat confronting choice to make. So I think for some people, that's a big factor. And so, of course, if I'm right about that, then the thing is to somehow get that critical mass that you need so that people no longer feel that it's a sort of socially deviant choice, that it's making them seem odd or eccentric or something like that. And I think actually we are getting significantly closer to that point. It's just become, so much easier. There's every restaurant menu that you look at is going to have vegetarian and vegan options on the menu, so everybody knows that there are people who don't eat this. I think it has got a lot easier, but I don't know that we're quite there yet. The second thing is that some people are, not very committed to their ethical views, and when their ethical views clash with something that they like the taste of, their taste will trump their ethical judgment. That's unfortunate, to say the least. What do we do about that? Well, maybe that's why these new plant-based burgers that taste much more like traditional burgers may have a role to play, and why eventually cultured meat may have a role to play. If we can replicate the taste and the chewiness, the mouthfeel, as they call it, of meat, that may make it easier for people to shift. And that may come, as I say, or perhaps arguably has come with burgers, but it will take a bit longer to come with steaks and other kinds of meat products. And the other thing goes back to what I was saying before about price. I think the burgers that taste closest to meat are still more expensive than meat. So we need to hope that price differential will disappear. And then it will be easy for people to choose something that tastes the way they expect and want it to taste, but can go along with the ethical values that they can acknowledge.
Great, thank you.
So I've got a question here that goes as follows. Do you think we can ever really give equal weight to equal interests as you envision in a society and legal system that is so human-centric? So the second part is, as humans, can we ever really know and understand the interests of animals and fairly weigh them against our own?
Okay, so they're both good questions. It's going to be, it's going to be difficult to give real equal weight at levels of official policy. We can try and do it in our own lives, and the more people who do it in their own lives, hopefully that will build up a constituency for living in a way that doesn't exploit animals or minimizes exploitation of animals. And if that constituency does build up, we may find political parties wanting to cater for it. But at the moment, as I think I said earlier, it's probably too radical a change for any major party to really come at. So you could expect government policies to not give equal weight to the interests of other sentient beings. And that's, by the way, there's a parallel here with government policies relating to people in low-income countries, because obviously government policies in an affluent country like Australia don't give anything like equal weight to the interests of people in low-income countries. We have many opportunities to save lives and help people in low-income countries that would be vastly cheaper and vastly better use of our economic resources than some of the things we do to save lives in Australia. But no government that wants to be re-elected by an Australian voting public is going to say, we think we should give equal weight to the people of, let's say, Pacific Islanders, just take people close to us, or New Guineans or someone like that. And therefore we're going to greatly increase our foreign aid to those countries at the cost of reducing some of the services we provide to Australians. And that's the way democracy works, unfortunately. And there have been various people who've tried to write about how you could restructure that to have a democratic system take the interests of animals into account. It's a book by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker, I think, called Zoopolis that does that. Recent book I saw by a young Dutch scholar called Janneke Vink. I think it's called The Open Society and Animals or something of that sort. So people are writing about how you can do that, but of course, to get a democracy to adopt those reforms, it has to already be prepared to take a stance for animals. That's a much stronger one than governments are taking at the moment. So that was the first question. And the other question was, in a sense, more factual one of, can we ever really know what it's like to be an animal and know what an animal is feeling? The answer to that is no, we can't completely know what it's like, not with a high degree of confidence. But that's in many areas also true about humans. We can't really put ourselves into the heads and feelings of other humans. We can try to do so. We talk about empathy, to empathize with what someone else is feeling perhaps in a difficult situation, a situation where they've lost someone they love, or some important future plans of theirs have been destroyed. So we can try, and we can assume, if you like, that they're feeling what we would feel in those situations, but that's probably not really true. People are different. Some people are much more sensitive than others. So there's a variation, but we cope with that. We approximate. And I think in practice, that's what we're going to do with non-human animals. So we're not going to be able to make sort of really fine comparisons. We're going to rather look at pretty gross kinds of abuses of animals for limited or no benefit to humans. And then we can say, well, obviously, confining hens in those cages in order to make their eggs a few cents cheaper is not consistent with giving equal weight to their sufferings as compared to human sufferings. And you can say the same for a lot of things that we are currently doing to animals, because they don't really attempt to give equal weight. They never have. Now, if you got rid of all of those things, then there would be a point at which somebody might say, well, look, you're still exploiting this animal in some particular way or other. And someone else would say, well, how do you know whether that's really bad for the animal or not? How do you know that the animal misses this? This question might arise about separating mothers from their young, right? When people, let's say, somebody wants to adopt a kitten, at what age should you separate the kitten from her mother? Well, there are people who've studied cats and can say you shouldn't do it right after birth. You should wait several weeks. How many weeks? Well, that's a judgment. It's a judgment that people make about at what point does the kitten really miss the mother, and at what point does the mother miss the kitten? And probably for our convenience, we do that at the wrong place as well. But at some point, you would have to reach a decision, and at that point, then it's reasonable for people to have different views.
Thank you.
This question is, do you think we should be using a more incrementalist approach in our ordinary social lives as well? I wonder about using terms like speciesism and vegan because of how negatively received they are.
Yeah, so there's a trade-off between the fact that some people react negatively to those terms and the educational power of those terms. I mean, as I said, I saw the term speciesism, and it immediately seemed to me that that was a useful tool for showing a completely different way of thinking about animals, and for showing what's wrong with the way we now think about animals. And if you read Animal Liberation, that concept plays an important part throughout the book, not only in the most philosophical chapter, which is the first, but there's also a chapter called Man's Dominion, the verse from the Bible, which God is supposed to have given man dominion over the animals. And it's really sort of a history of speciesism, and it talks about how throughout different stages of history we can see people justifying what in fact is speciesism in terms of various religious or other ideologies. So I think that that's useful, and I think I'm continuing to use it. I don't think the reaction is that negative. The other term you mentioned is vegan. Yes, some people do react negatively to that, and I know a lot of people are talking about plant-based rather than vegan. They talk about eating plant-based food or living on a plant-based diet rather than a vegan diet. Again, I think it's a term that's now understood. People know what it means reasonably well. And I think it plays a useful role. I think restaurants put it on their menus saying, you know, these dishes are vegan, or we can prepare these dishes vegan if you request. So I'm certainly prepared to continue to use that term. In fact, I've got a book coming out, reprint some of my earlier essays that Penguin will publish in Australia, I hope by the end of the year, and it's going to be called Why Vegan, with a question mark. So I think it's worth getting that idea out. It's too useful a label to abandon because some people react negatively to it.
Thank you.
So, okay. So this question reads, the environmental movement has been quite effective in trying to shut down the fossil fuel industry, so groups like Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion, for instance. If the sole purpose of these groups is to halt warming of the planet and stop ecological genocide, and science tells us that animal agriculture is one of the leading causes of these things, why don't these groups also advocate for plant-based diets or vegan diets? Well, so do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, it's kind of
I have quite a lot of thoughts on that. Perhaps some of you have seen the movie Cowspiracy, which was a movie made a few years ago by a couple of guys who learned that animal agriculture makes a major contribution to climate change. And certainly at that time, the major environmental organizations were not talking about it. This was in the United States. They were talking about Sierra Club, I think, I can't remember, Environmental Defenders. And they actually went to the offices of those places, telling them that they wanted to film them talking about climate change and its causes. And so they did, and when they started, they were talking about fossil fuels and so on. And then at one point, the filmmakers throw in this question, well, what about meat? And you can see that people the environmental spokespeople are taken aback by that. Although they don't deny that meat is a major contributor to climate change. They know that, but they don't talk about it. And I think this was part of the point made in the film too, that's because they rely on support from a broad membership base, and that membership base will certainly have more vegans in it than the general public, but it's probably still not majority vegan. It's probably still quite far off being majority vegan. So I think they're worried about losing support, losing financial support, which means that they won't be able to maintain their staff and keep up their campaigns. And so a lot of the campaigning about climate that points out the animal-related aspects of it comes from people who are part of the animal rights or vegan movement, rather than, or from political parties like yourselves. I remember many years ago when the Dutch Party for the Animals was just starting, I went and they invited me to give a talk there. And they already had a T-shirt that was talking about climate change and the effect that meat has on climate. So they gave me one, which I may still have somewhere, I don't know. Yeah, so I think we certainly ought to be getting that message out, and we ought to be encouraging environmental organizations to do it. And I have noticed some progress there, in that environmental organizations seem to be less likely to serve meat at their events now than they were a decade ago, let's say.
Thank you.
Cool. So the next question, I've been learning more about animal agriculture in America, receiving subsidies and tax bailouts from the government. So supply and demand isn't really a thing. Animal products will be made in a surplus, won't be sold, consumed, thus going to waste. But these companies will still be compensated. Do we know if this happens in Australia? And if so, what more can we be doing to make a difference to animal lives?
The subsidy question is a bit complicated, and I think it's actually a little more complicated even in the United States than that question suggests, because the major agricultural subsidies are going to plant producers, basically to corn growers, and there are also substantial subsidies to cotton growers. So it's not as if there's a lot of targeted subsidies just going to animal producers that don't go to other people. The problem basically in the United States is that there's this huge farm bill, which is a subsidy bill, which is entirely political in that it supports the farmers in a lot of states out in the Midwest, which are dominated by farming. And the US, and of course this is also true in Australia, but it has a somewhat different effect. The US Senate, every state gets the same number of representatives in the Senate. So states with 500,000 people like Wyoming get as many senators as California and New York State. But the difference between Australia and the United States political system is that the Senate is really an equally important house of Congress, whereas the Senate in Australia is not as important as the House of Representatives. The Senate in Australia is if it blocks bills, they have this double dissolution procedure and so on, and generally also we have a different party system. So generally things that go through the House will be supported by all the members of that party in the Senate, and it's a House of review, but in the United States it's not, and so that is really the major reason why this absurd farm subsidy bill keeps going through, even though people on the right who are anti-tax and anti-government and libertarians, a lot of them oppose it, but it still gets through because the senators from those states vote for it. Yes, it does help animal agriculture, undoubtedly, mainly though indirectly by keeping the price of corn very cheap, and as corn is the major food for intensively farmed animals in the United States, that keeps the price of meat low. All the cattle that are being fed on corn in feedlots, and a substantial part of the diet of pigs and chickens as well. So it is a subsidy, but I don't think it's really true to say that therefore the meat producers in particular would go on producing, no matter how much they actually lose. I think if people stopped buying their products, they would be out of business. And there's no question about that. And in fact, we are seeing a big decline in the dairy industry in the United States recently. Some of the major dairy companies have gone bankrupt because, well, at least in part because there has been a shift to plant-based milks in the US and falling milk prices. There's a variety of reasons, and I won't go into them all. So, as I say, I think the question did somewhat oversimplify the situation in the United States. I'm not really very expert on what kinds of agricultural subsidies and incentives there are in Australia, but I think that I don't think the industry is really reliant on them entirely. But I could be corrected. If we have somebody with some agricultural economics, they might take a different view. But I think that again, it's a matter of there being a demand for it, and of course the demand for Australia's animal products is not only domestic. We're a major exporter, particularly of live cattle and sheep, and of beef. So it's not only the demand here, and that's part of the problem too.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so this question reads, the Greens and some other parties are really pushing the slaughter of so-called pest or feral animals. So I suppose this would be with things like, brumbies in Kosciuszko National Park, or, cats that get out and are killing native animals. The Animal Justice Party believes in finding other options to help negate the effects of these animals where there are issues. What's your view on this sort of thing?
I certainly think that we ought to be looking for other options, that is the best ultimate outcome. Many years ago, I was on a CSIRO ethics committee, and there was some research going on then to try to find ways of sterilizing some of the feral animals that we have in Australia. I think particularly rabbits was one of the ones. The idea was to have a mosquito-borne virus, I think it was, that would cause the rabbits to become sterile. And that looked like pretty interesting research. Of course, the worry was, how do we know this is not going to make our native animals become sterile too? But the theory was that as our native animals are marsupials, you could have things that specifically targeted rabbits, non-marsupials. But it seems not to have gone anywhere, unfortunately. But I think it would be worth trying to develop those sorts of more humane techniques for getting rid of feral species that are causing the extinction or threatening the extinction of Australian native animals and damaging our ecology. But that would take some time, and the difficult question is, what do you do in the meantime? So I think we have to, as I said before, we have to try to build coalitions and make compromises. And one of our natural allies is the Greens. I think many people in the Animal Justice Party support green objectives in general about the planet as a whole. You'd be crazy not to. So, this is certainly an issue that if we pushed it too hard, would divide the animal movement from the Greens and environmental movement. So to me, the other question about this is not just the distinction between lethal and non-lethal methods, which is what I was talking about before in talking about trying to make these feral animals infertile, but the distinction between lethal methods that kill quickly and humanely and lethal methods that are inflicting horribly slow, long, drawn-out deaths on animals. Our government has for many decades been introducing myxomatosis, new strains of myxomatosis to try to get rid of rabbits, which is a horrible slow death. It takes several days. The rabbits become blind, then they get lame. They therefore can't get to water or feed themselves, and they probably die of thirst mostly. I think that's not acceptable even for problems as big as rabbit problems. So there are more humane methods. The Khaleesi virus, which was subsequently introduced, is at least quicker than that. But I think we ought to be always trying to find the most humane methods that we can use and see what they are, and then work with Greens and others to say, well, yes, let's put some money into developing research so we can do this non-lethally, but in the meantime, let's at least eliminate the methods that are the cruelest and focus on those that are going to kill animals swiftly.
Thank you.
So next, I'm going to combine a couple of questions together. In your long experience, what have been the top 3 most effective ways of persuading people to stop contributing to animal suffering? And other one, sorry, and are there any practical parallels that can be drawn from the historical abolitionist movements and the current work in anti-speciesism?
Sorry, within abolitionist movement and current work in anti-speciesism?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the 3 most effective ways of getting people to stop exploiting animals. I've focused mostly on factory farming because I think that's by far the largest source of animal suffering. The numbers just dwarf anything else. The number of animals, well, the numbers don't dwarf anything else. Actually, the thing that they don't dwarf is fishing and the commercial fishing industry, which has even vastly larger numbers. But in terms of land animals, factory farming dwarfs. You can add everything else together. You can add animals used in research, animals used in the fur industry, abused dogs and cats, you name it. You can add it all together, multiply it by 10 or times or more, and you're still nowhere near the billions of animals, tens of billions of animals that are worldwide that are in factory farms. So that's the area that I've focused on most. And what are the most effective ways of getting people not to do that? Well, educate them about what factory farming is like for animals. I think there's still a lot of people who don't know how their food is produced, and trying to show them photos or videos, talking to them about it, getting them to understand all of the details of what happens, using the testimony of people who are experts, not just animal rights advocates, but professors of veterinary science who've said that factory farms are cruel, that they cause animal suffering, that they're unacceptable from an animal welfare point of view. There's lots of quotes out there about that. And those kinds of methods seem to me to be the most effective. But again, we don't have good research into what works. There's psychology research I mentioned is starting to look at different things, which kinds of films and videos work best. There's some research going on about that, so look at that. If you want to read more, there's a website called Animal Charity Evaluators that evaluates some of the most effective charities worldwide, and it has discussion as well on what the evidence is that certain things that animal charities do will be effective and other things won't be effective. So it's an important area of study. I think it's worth investigating. So your second question was about abolitionism and anti-speciesism.
Yeah.
I think I referred to that a little bit before when I was talking about the opposition to the California referenda to increase space for farm animals. And it was the abolitionist groups who describe themselves as abolitionists who, not all of them I should say, but at least some of them, who actually didn't support, and in one case of one organization actually even opposed said that people should vote against the motion to give animals more space. So I just think that's incredibly naive, really, to think that somehow you're going to bring about the total abolition of animals exploitation by voting against a referendum that will give animals better conditions, hundreds of millions of animals better conditions in factory farms. And I think that's very misguided of people. I respect their sincerity and their conviction, but I think they're really misguided. And I think the question mentioned one of the questions mentioned my long experience. So in my long experience, I have come across people in various countries and in various areas for whom clinging to some kind of absolute truth was really important, and they couldn't let go of it, even if it didn't seem to be well based in evidence that it was actually going to do animals any good. And that, to me, is the kind of views that people must be some tendency in humans that we want to think that we know some truth, and that's, I think, part of the appeal of religion. It says, this is the truth, this is how you must live, this is what God says, or this is what the religious leader of the group says, and that's how you must live. And I think that's something's going on there that attracts people to some very hardline and absolutist religious groups, attracted people to political ideologies like communism in Stalin's era, when again all the evidence was that this was a pretty horrendous system, but people didn't want to let go of the truth. And I think there's something like that going on among, again, not all abolitionists, but among some fringes of this movement that just don't want to accept that it's necessary to make any compromises with the evil of animal exploitation at all.
Interesting, thank you.
Okay, so you spoke earlier about how we might want to distinguish the sort of moral status of humans and non-human animals based on the sorts of interests that they have or their sort of capacity for different interests. And some of the things you discussed were, for instance, non-human animals don't seem to have sort of future directedness, right? They don't sort of see themselves doing things in the next few years. And these are the sorts of interests that might be important to humans. So you might want to evaluate a human life over a non-human life, for instance, on that basis. I suppose, so this is sort of combining a couple of questions. So in the past, you were a preference utilitarian. Now I've made the switch to hedonic utilitarianism. And I suppose it's not obvious why those sorts of future-directed cognitive states impact sort of the pleasure or displeasure that humans and non-humans will feel.
Right. Okay. Yes, that's a interesting philosophical issue, and the questioner is quite correct. It's not obvious. It's not as direct. And if you're a preference utilitarian, then you give weight to the preferences people have, and if they have preferences for living long enough to pursue their career, then if they're killed, you thwart that preference. And there's a very direct connection there. And I did hold that view for most of my life. I'm become persuaded that it's less defensible than a view that talks about their happiness or well-being, pleasure, pain, and so on. And that means that you can't directly argue that killing is bad because it thwarts a preference. But so what you have to do really is rely on the indirect relevance of the future directedness. That is, that although it's true that if somebody is instantly killed without any warning, they don't suffer more because of their future directedness than a being who is not future directed. But what is true is that other humans will become insecure and worried about their possible loss. And also, of course, since humans are social animals and most of us have people who are family or close friends, there will be an impact too in terms of their loss and their grief and their sense of someone having been taken from them. So it's true that in a way, perhaps your question is saying this, as a hedonistic utilitarian, I should have said more about those aspects of the difference between killing humans and killing animals, rather than simply talking about future directedness. But that's, it's part of, I did that because I was not giving a philosophy lecture. I was giving a short talk to try to lay out some of the foundations of my ethical views. And that's why I didn't get into those complications. But I think I even said, if I remember rightly in those remarks, probably some of the details of this will come out with questions. And this is a question that's very well brought out, some of the nuances that you need to go into if you want to have a coherent overall philosophical view that matches these applied views.
Thank you.
So next one, what is your best advice to maintain hope and motivation for a kind of future when it feels so hopeless? As there is so much work to be done in animal activism and is such a long road ahead, can you give us some inspiring words to get us hopeful and working towards a common good?
Yeah, in brief, it's to focus on the positive and on the progress that has been made. And there has been progress made. If I go back to when I first got involved in this, the whole idea that we could really change something as big as factory farming, which was already in existence, although sort of relatively newer and less well known, might have seemed completely hopeless, because there were hardly anybody who thought the way that I and this couple of friends that I had in Oxford thought. But perhaps in a way, surprisingly, there's been considerable progress made. That some of these worst forms of confinement that I already mentioned in connection with the Californian referendum have been phased out, and not only in California but across the entire European Union. the kinds of standard battery cages that existed in the 1970s everywhere are prohibited. The individual sow stalls are prohibited. The individual stalls for veal calves are prohibited. So there's been quite significant progress made, and that practical progress has been reflected in changes in attitudes as well. I'm focusing, I guess, on Western nations, basically Europe and the United States and Australia. But there have been significant changes in attitudes. Laws have improved. Practices with regard to animal experimentation have certainly improved in those countries. I'm hoping in the next year or two to revise the text of animal liberation again. But I know already, looking around, that the kinds of experiments that I described, particularly in the first edition, which came out in 1975, and which were, there in journals all the time. There are lots of journals you would look at, and you could more or less at random open experiment journals that did horrendous experiments on animals. That's greatly reduced now. I wouldn't say it's completely gone, but it's greatly reduced, and that's partly because we now have animal experimentation ethics committees, which go up by different names in different countries, but basically they do the same thing. Experimenters have to put up their proposals to those committees. They know they're going to be looked at. They know that there'll be at least one or two non-scientists or lay people, perhaps animal welfare representatives on those committees. And they don't even try to put up the kinds of experiments that used to be just routinely done. So I sort of look at these positive changes, and I don't feel that the situation is hopeless. I feel that we started on a road some 50 odd years ago, and we're still heading down that road. It's taking a long time, but we are making progress. Now, I should perhaps say that that focus on Western nations ignores the fact that during the same period, China in particular has gone from being a quite poor nation where most people couldn't afford to eat meat to being a much more prosperous nation where the demand for meat has skyrocketed, and therefore probably worldwide there are more animals in factory farms today than there were in the 1970s, just because of the huge number of factory farms in China and other places in East Asia. So, if you look at it that way, you'll think it's negative. But I rather look at the progress that has been made, and I believe that that progress will come to China and other countries in Asia as well. There are people working towards that, and I think that it may take some time still. It may also take the development of meat-like plant-based and cultured products, but I think that eventually, any nation that stops and reflects and that doesn't really have the desperate need to feed its population that requires it to, go along with cruelty to animals, is going to go down the same path that the Western nations are slowly moving along, even if much too slowly.
Thank you.
So, what do you think the role of compassion is in the animal justice movement? And maybe if you'd like to say a bit about your thoughts on, I guess, affective versus cognitive.
Okay, you're getting the harder philosophical questions, aren't you?
I think the animal movement is very significantly dependent on people who are compassionate and extend their compassion to animals. And I think a lot of the people who come into the movement and support it, that's their primary motivation. Many of them come through essentially caring for companion animals, dogs and cats in particular. And at some point they have a realization that it's not only dogs and cats who can feel things. One of the great strategists for animals in the last quarter of the 20th century was a man called Henry Spira, a friend of mine in the United States. And the story he tells is that he'd had a whole life working for the underprivileged, but for the human underprivileged in various ways, for marching for black in the South, for unionist, for workers against corrupt union bosses, and so on. But he'd never really done anything for animals until one day a friend who was going overseas dumped a cat on him and said, "Hey, you look after my cat, I've got to go." And the cat basically, got into his affections, as cats very often do. And at one point, Henry sort of suddenly asked himself the question, so how is it I'm patting this animal and sticking a knife and fork into another one? And, recognize that these were similar sorts of things. So I think Henry's a good example to talk about exactly that question that you raised about the role of affective and cognitive reactions, basically emotions and reasons, you could say, because Henry was clearly moved by his love for that cat that had developed. And who knows, without that, he might not have seen the point that he did then see, that here he was working for underprivileged all of his life, but it was only underprivileged humans. And yet animals were perhaps the most underprivileged of all, because they couldn't even express themselves or organize politically or anything like that. So it was that combination in Henry. And some people, as I say, it's mostly emotional. In other people, it's mostly cognitive. I think, I'm an example of that. I've never considered myself an animal lover. I never particularly wanted to have a companion animal when I was young, or when I was independent. We did adopt a stray cat once I had children, because they wanted that, but it's not something that I would have really had my own motivation to do. And I got interested in this because I met some people in Oxford who, as I said, were already vegetarians, and basically said to me, how do you justify treating animals the way that piece of meat on your plate was treated when it was an animal? And I looked into that for a while and decided I couldn't. So, I'm at one extreme of that side, and many other people are at the other extreme, and then there's people in all sorts of stages in the middle. And I hope that the animal movement will continue to draw on all of those strengths. But it's important that it doesn't only go with the emotions, because if it did, then you would be focused mainly on those animals that people care about most, the dogs and cats in particular. And that was how the animal movement pretty much was, I think, when in the 1970s, that most of the attention was on dogs and cats and maybe horses, but you hardly heard anything about factory farming from the animal welfare organizations or the RSPCA, and not very much about animals being experimented on either, except for the specific anti-vivisectionist organizations. So we don't want to go back to that. So we do need to make sure that we emphasize the point that all of these animals are capable of suffering, and there's no reason for confining a pig in a way that you would think it cruel to confine a dog.
Cool. Thanks for that. And also, just full disclosure, I am a philosophy grad student, so it's possible that I'm putting a bit of a philosophical spin on these.
I'm sure that's got more than possible.
Having a few words at the end of these, Kramer. Next question. While animal use for food production is less complicated to identify and educate people away from, what political emphasis should be placed on the use of sport animals such as racing dogs, social horse riding, etc., in the attempt to change a culture? With respect to human behavior, how should this area be approached?
Yeah. So as I was saying, I mean, the suffering of animals used for food vastly outweighs all of these others. And I know that greyhound racing has been a significant issue in New South Wales, but you'd have to acknowledge that the suffering of all of the greyhounds in New South Wales, doesn't add up to as much suffering as just one factory farm of all the different factory farms that you have. On the other hand, as you say, it's a useful way of educating the public, and when you get shocking revelations about the treatment of greyhounds or racehorses or other animals who the public imagines are being well treated, then that is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to educate the public in the idea that, if you have this kind of attitude to animals that people have, that this is not important, that it's not serious, you're going to get people abusing animals in all sorts of ways, behind closed doors usually, and it's rare that you find out about it. So in that sense, it's a useful education opportunity that you should take. Plus, the other thing that's really relevant, it may be that in some of these cases you can actually have a victory. You can get public support on your side. That seemed to be for a time what would happen in the greyhound issue. I know that ended up more disappointingly, but and it also seemed to be for a time in the live export industry, live export of sheep to the Middle East I'm talking about now, where in the wake of all of that horrendous footage, there was a huge amount of pressure on the government to stop the live export trade, and although that didn't quite succeed, they did stop it during the summer months, which was some sort of victory. So I think it's important. This goes back to this question about how do you stay positive when it all seems so hopeless. I think it's important that the animal movement should, from time to time, have victories. This was part of, since I mentioned Henry Spira a moment ago, this was part of his strategy. He started out with, he always wanted to start out with something that you could actually win. So the first campaign that he ever ran was a campaign against a series of experiments on about 60 cats that was going on in the middle of New York City in the American Museum of Natural History, but behind closed doors in that museum. And he took this campaign up because he thought this is a winnable campaign. And at that time, although there'd been, I've no idea, maybe like almost a century of anti-vivisection campaigning, the American anti-vivisection movement had never stopped a single experiment on animals. And he thought, well, we need to do something to build up some credibility to show that we have some clout. And so he picked that experiment, which was particularly vulnerable. It was cats. It was not cancer research. It was bizarre research about how removing the senses of cats, like their sense of hearing or smell or something, would affect their sexual behavior. It was taxpayer funded, and it was at a public institution that people visited every day. And they could express their views about it when they visited. So he won that, and that was important. It helped give him credibility, gave the movement credibility, and he went on to larger and bigger, more significant victories from there. So I think it is important to try to win some victories, even if they're small. And if you have a winnable case and good evidence, and the opposition is not going to be as powerful as, let's say, farming opposition is, then sure, go for it. Try and show that you can accomplish specific things for some animals.
Thank you. Do we have time for more, you reckon, Kramer?
Could do one or two, I guess.
Yeah, we can. We'll see how we go. So you sort of touched on this throughout, but what sorts of legislative changes do you think would be worthwhile for the Animal Justice Party to pursue over the next 5 years or so?
This is becoming a bit of an echo now, but whatever you can do in the area of factory farming, I think would be worth doing. If you can work with other animal organizations to have reforms similar to those in the European Union, which are not completely implemented here, as I understand it. I better not get into too much of the details, but I think our standards for confinement of farm animals are still lag behind those that Europe adopted, almost 20 years ago now. So, doing things like that, I think, would be really important if you can. what you can do about COVID-19 and that kind of issue is something that's very topical, and you can certainly get some attention to that. But as I said, the government seems to be doing the right thing as far as the wet markets are concerned. So that would again go back to the factory farming issue. Otherwise, look, I don't feel sufficiently on top of current issues, but anything that you can contribute to, whether it's things like ending exhibitions of wild animals that are cruel, it might be freeing dolphins and so on. Those kinds of things that evoke a popular image with public will probably help the Animal Justice Party to maintain a constituency and to reach more people. So, you know, some of that is certainly worth doing, even if the number of animals affected is small.
Cool. Thank you.
Maybe one other thing that I'll just mention, because we were talking about plant-based foods and cultured meat. And I know there are efforts to try to make it more difficult for these products to come on stream. Again, I'm not quite sure what's going on in Australia, but in many countries there have been efforts to prevent people calling something meat if it's not from an animal. Similarly with the non-dairy milks, that doesn't seem to be happening here as far as I can see. They seem to be able to sell that. But to try to block legislation that is going to make things more difficult for the alternatives to meat from animals could be a useful role in the next few years.
Thank you. So Sitara, should we?
Yeah, maybe we could wrap it up at this point.
Okay. Very good. It was nice to get a good range of questions, and I miss not being able to see the audience, apart from you, of course, Kramer and Sitara. But it's better, certainly better than not being able to speak to your members and supporters at all.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. I found it very interesting. I'm sure everyone else did as well. So I guess the last thing I'll say is, I suppose it may be hard given the current, economic climate, but I would encourage everyone who's participated here today to donate to one of the charities listed on lifeyoucansave.org, or if you're sort of primarily focused on animal charities, animalcharityevaluators.org. These are extremely highly effective charities doing a lot of good work. So if you make a donation to any of those, or to the Life You Can Save itself or Animal Charity Evaluators, that would be really great. And it'd be a very nice way to thank Peter for coming.
Thanks very much. But, this is a remarkable political party that isn't asking people to donate to yourselves so that you can maintain your electoral representatives. But that just shows how much you're thinking of the broad good on the whole. And that's great.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Thank you very much, Peter, for speaking. And we'll end the webinar here, I think.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.